Scotland's Hate Crime and Public Order Act came into force recently. The law expands existing legislation to include transgender identity as a protected characteristic from hate crimes. Riks has met with David Thunder, political philosophy researcher and lecturer Institute for Culture and Society University in Spain. Welcome to Riks Europe.
Thank you very much.
So can you tell us what motivated the development of the Hate Crime and Public Order Act in Scotland?
Well, I'd say it's part of a broader international trend to worry about what they call increasing incidents of hate offences. And this is both Ireland and Scotland. So Ireland had just attempted to pass a hate offences bill, which was more radical than the Scottish bill, in fact, because in the case of the Irish bill, you didn't have to demonstrate intent. It was enough to demonstrate recklessness in your use of words. Whereas in the case of the Scottish bill, you actually have to demonstrate intent for most of the offences. You have to prove that someone intends to stir up hatred in order to prosecute them successfully. And I think, frankly, I would say it's an ideological kind of development in the sense that the political culture has somehow shifted somewhat, and the NGOs and non-governmental organizations have played a big role in lobbying governments in bringing this problem, at least what they present as a problem, to their attention. So NGOs have been very active, a number of NGOs have been very active in helping to bring to the fore the issue of hate speech. But of course, hate speech legislation of some sort or other has been on the statute books for many, many years. So what we're seeing here is a radicalization and an expansion of that existing hate speech legislation. Because in Scotland, there was already, in fact, a kind of a crime of stirring up hatred based on ethnicity, race and ethnicity. But what they did was they expanded that to a bunch of different categories like protected characteristics like age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variation in sex characteristics. If you're prosecuted successfully under this legislation, you could be imprisoned for up to 7 years. So it's a very, very serious punishment if you're actually charged and convicted of one of these offences. And one very important aspect of this legislation in Scotland is that, in fact, even speech that you engage in the privacy of your own home or residence is liable for prosecution. So if you threw a dinner party and one of your guests, made an allegation to the police that you were stirring up hatred in your speech, you could be under a police investigation for the speech that you engaged in your own home. And that's a big change because the previous legislation did not permit that, but the new legislation does permit that.
And Minister Siobhan Brown mentioned protection of freedom of expression within the legislation. And there's been a lot of criticism around this, how they will coexist. So how can they protect freedom of expression under this new law?
Well, they claim that the bar for prosecution is quite high, and therefore that it's difficult to get to actually prosecute someone for hate speech, because in order to be prosecuted for stirring up hatred, it has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt that you intended to stir up hatred against a group or an individual within these protected characteristics, one of these protected characteristics. And now the problem is, in fact, that this defense of the legislation does not work because it's enough to have a complaint lodged against you to spark a police investigation. And so the issue is not whether you're prosecuted or not. In fact, I believe very few people will be prosecuted under the legislation because it's quite difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt the intent to stir up hatred. There are lots of reasons why I could make a comment. Maybe I want to just criticize somebody. I want to get something off my chest. I'm worried about an issue. How can someone prove that I actually intended to stir up hatred against black people or against transgender people or whatever? So I think that's quite difficult to get those prosecutions. However, what you can do if you want to really make life difficult for your neighbor or your boss or your colleague is file a police complaint so that the police is obligated to investigate your complaint. And then you have an embarrassing police investigation upon you. And in that sense, it does curtail freedom of expression because it will have a chilling effect, because a lot of people will keep their mouth shut rather than risk a police investigation and potentially a prosecution. And I think that's a very important point to make, because some people think that the only thing that matters is whether you're actually put in prison. That's not true. Being subject to a police investigation is extremely stressful, and it wastes a lot of your time, and you might have to hire a lawyer to defend yourself. So in my view, these defenses don't work.
But how would this new law aim to address harm caused by hatred and prejudice in the communities, considering the fact that there is still a threat towards freedom of expression?
Yes, well, according to the police, according to rather the Scottish government, they are committed to having a multi-pronged approach to combating hate speech, and that they want to work with communities so that it's not just based on the law, but also that they will have communities be organizing various different events to raise awareness of hate speech, and to somehow create a more inclusive community. And I think having the threat of either a police investigation or a prosecution hanging over your head for the things you say in the privacy of your home, I don't think, because you might touch a sensitive issue, for example, I don't think that helps to advance the cause of reducing hate speech in society, because the law is a very blunt instrument, and trying to tackle a very complex social issue by just threatening people with prosecution for their speech is wrong-headed and very confused, because you can't actually stop people from feeling hatred and from expressing hatred, especially in more private kind of situations, by going after them with legal threats. I mean, it's more likely, in fact, to rile people up and to cause them to feel bitter and resentful against the government and against the kind of anti-hate speech lobbies. So I believe it's very, very misguided to try to solve social problems like this with draconian legislation. I think these sorts of problems have to be solved in a more kind of subtle way by engagement, by free speech, by people actually exposing the problem with hate speech in a public forum and showing it up for what it is. But simply shutting it down, it'll just fester and it'll just grow, and you'll have a backlash. It's not going to work, in my opinion.
Are there any specific safeguards in place to ensure that legitimate expression is not unjustly penalized under this new law?
Well, the law recognizes, from my recollection, I don't have it right in front of me, the details, but the law does recognize in some form that there has to be due recognition given to the right to free speech. And and of course, free speech is recognized in international law, and it's also recognized in national law as well, in Scottish law. So I guess you could say that they would say this has to be reconciled with the right to free speech. And there is some form of recognition in the legislation that free speech rights, it has to be balanced against the right to free expression. And so, for example, reasonable contributions to public debate should be permitted under this legislation. But the problem with these sorts of safeguards is that since they never define what hatred is in this law, it's extremely vague and fuzzy what they mean by hate speech, and so that really opens it up to it's very ambiguous. So it really depends on the interpretation of a jury or the interpretation of a prosecutor as to what we mean by hate speech. There's no clear definition. So it does definitely kind of bring into question. Let's say it does pose a threat to freedom of expression, partly because the concept of hate speech is nowhere defined in this law, and it's nowhere defined in other hate speech laws either, like Ireland's hate speech bill, which of course is now not going to pass at least for the lifetime of this government, because it's just become so embarrassing to them that they've sort of just parked it.
And it's been said that this bill is necessary because every day in Scotland around 18 hate crimes are committed. But it's new, of course, it's very recent, but has there been any improvement?
I think it's too soon to say whether there's been an improvement. There was an existing, there was a law in place before this. This updates existing legislation against hate crimes. So there was, for example, legislation against crimes aggravated by hatred, right, against certain protected characteristics, people of certain protected characteristics, aggravated by prejudice, I should say. Now, have those laws reduced the incidence of hate crime? I'm not sure. I don't know what the evidence says about that. Honestly, I'm more concerned about crime in general than just hate crimes. I think just tagging on the label hate doesn't really solve the problem, because the real issue is that we have to tackle the problem of crime, whatever the motivation behind it. And so you have to look and see, is the police successfully tackling crime, and will this legislation help the police successfully tackle crime? And the answer is it won't, because it's going to waste their time and tie up their hands in countless frivolous complaints that are brought before the police that will not end up being prosecuted successfully for the most part. They received over 3,000 complaints within just a few days of the legislation passing, many of which were actually against the First Minister of Scotland for a speech he made about white people. So it's a little bit of a laughable, absurd piece of legislation. The police have themselves said that they're going to have to hire people, give overtime, pay overtime in order for their staff to process these complaints. So it's a waste of police time, valuable police time, that they could be spending fighting real crimes on the streets.
What would you say could be further implications of this law? What could it lead to? Could it lead to more segregation in society? And are there any positives with this law?
I would say there are really no upsides to this law, because even from the point of view of someone who wants, to prosecute hate speech, because the bar is so high for prosecution, it's going to be very difficult to actually, get a successful prosecution. So there'll be just a whole, backlog of complaints that can't be prosecuted, tying up police resources. So I think there are no upsides and only downsides to this legislation, even for people who want to prosecute hate speech. And I think I'm more worried about the implications for the atmosphere in society than about the law itself. because by violating the sanctity of the home and by opening up people to prosecution, the threat of prosecution for speech in their own home, they're sowing the seeds of social division and social distrust. Because if I invite friends over to a dinner party, I'm certainly not expecting that one of my friends might report me to the police for a bit of light banter that we have after tea. And I think when that happens, when you know that that can happen, people start to go on their guard. They start to feel fearful about what they say in almost any venue, because nowhere is exempt from the possibility of prosecution here for speech. So, and then the fact that certain groups are protected, are given some sort of special protection, also brings in deep unfairness into society because, you know, for example, J.K. Rowling has been insisting, you know, that she wants to continue to speak out against, you know, the use of transgender characteristics in order for men to enter in, biological men to enter into women's sports, for example, or for biological offenders, criminals to enter into women's prisons. And she's saying, well, you can arrest me if you want to. I'm going to keep talking. And the police was put up against, their back was against the wall. They were kind of cornered by Rowling, and they just had to say publicly they wouldn't arrest her. They weren't going to arrest her. I mean, partly because it was a public relations nightmare for them to be pushed into a corner like that. And they had to say something, I guess. So they just said, no, we're not going to arrest her. But that doesn't guarantee, it doesn't remove the uncertainty and the fact that someone in the future who speaks out against the trans lobby, maybe a trans activist, will report them to the police. It provides a weapon for activists, political activists, to harass their enemies or their adversaries, their political adversaries, by just bringing a lot of tendentious and frivolous police complaints against them, in the hopes that they will embarrass them and subject them to, you know, a very, very annoying police investigation. So for me, it's just short-sighted, and it's going to cause a lot of social division and strife and distrust. And I think it's been an embarrassment to the Scottish government so far. And I think a lot of them will probably start to wonder were they right to pass it, because it's becoming so embarrassing for them.
Thank you, David Thunder, political philosophy researcher and lecturer, Institute for Culture and Society, University in Spain.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.